Okay, I'll get started here in a second. Everybody can see the screen, right?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So this will be going over the essay and giving you some general tips on how to get started. And then next week, I'm hoping you'll come with some questions and hopefully some examples from your work that you're working on for your paper. And then at the end of the session, I'm going to ask you to pick some topics and some suggestions for next week so I know how to prepare. So in general, these are kind of tips that would be helpful in any class where you're doing writing, but also more specifically towards criminal justice majors and the type of writing that you're going to be asked to do. The other thing to think about is that in any class where writing is kind of important, professors are usually looking for kind of a particular style of writing, and that's what I'm going to try to help you with over the next few weeks. So just kind of a reminder, big picture, is that this is 1/3 of your grade in 2 parts. So you'll have your draft, which is 15%, and I'll grade them as 15. You'll get 15 if it's completed. You did kind of what was expected. 10 will be are you almost there? You're kind of in the process of getting there. If you get a 5, that means that you need serious revision, that we need to try to figure out how to get you caught up. For the final paper, I'm going to put together a grading rubric based on the drafts that I get from you. And so it'll be graded based on how well you're doing, as opposed to some kind of other standard. So that will be later this month. There are in the syllabus, if you go to the different supports that I provided, I think it's about page 7, those are all hyperlinks. So when they're underlined, they're hyperlinks. So there's a few that could be helpful here in your research. You could use the library, there's a writing center, there's also tutoring, and so those would be things that you'd want to try to use to help you improve your paper overall. The other thing is probably the cheating thing, which I'm going to go over a little bit today on how to do citations. So it's not crucial in this particular paper, but you should be aware of what plagiarism is and how you can get in trouble for it. And then again, just the big picture here is that we've been thinking about intersectional injustice, which is class, gender, and race. And the kind of original theorist on this topic was Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a lawyer, scholar, and writer who mostly studies the civil rights, critical race theory, and black and feminist law. So this kind of course has been able to help you see how there's the double-edged sword concept, where on one hand laws are used to control groups, but there's also this kind of resistance and this push for social change, which also uses the other side of the law. And then just to go through the details, you're going to want to email me your draft the week of May 23rd, so about 12 days away, at the CUNY edu. Make sure you keep a copy for your records, and this should be in a Word document. It's kind of the standard when you send papers to your professors, and so if you're able to put that in a Word document, or if you're not, try to use Google Docs, and we can go from there. And so next class we'll be trying to work together, and then also that week that class will try to be finishing up any issues you're having so that you can get those papers done the way that you'd like. So just to give you a clear sense of what we're doing then is, so today we're doing instructions and brainstorming. So I'm hoping that you'll have the midterm case study on your mind, as well as the Callahan case, and then the first week's reading on socio-legal analysis. If you don't have that with you, it's okay. You can go back after this session and organize those materials. Next week, we're going to get more into workshop mode. So you're going to bring questions for me. You could share any of the draft that you've put together so far. If you have any questions about the writing process, we'll try to work on that, and I'll be a lot more specific in the workshop. And then the third stage will be you'll have sent in your draft, and then I'm going to give you feedback on that draft, telling you things that you should work on, and then you'll refer to the grading rubric to bring your grade up to hopefully an A. So this replaces the final exam. This is largely because this is a writing intensive class, meaning you're getting your writing credit for graduation. The content I'm asking you to do is to show me you can do critical analysis using socio-legal thinking. It's something we've been practicing this whole semester, so now this is your chance to show me you can do it. We've got a lot of support and time in the second half. I've given us several weeks now so that you don't have to rush. You can do this in stages, and hopefully you can work your way up to an A. That's really my goal, is that everybody's able to get an A, provided you're able to show me that you're deepening your understanding. And probably the hardest part for most of you will be applying the course materials. So we're going to try to figure out how to do that. So this is step one. So this is us doing the brainstorming and instructions. And so I found this picture over here on the internet, which I think is a good job of what students need to do in order to put together a good paper. So I think what I've noticed over all the years I've been teaching is, I guess I'll say this, in the old days, when I was a student, you had a piece of paper and you wrote out an outline in class using Roman numerals, and on another piece of paper, you just kind of free form. You just kind of have notes and you try to figure out what you're doing ahead of time. What I see students do today is you just open up your word processor and you start typing. That's probably the worst way to write a paper in the history of writing papers. It's very difficult to organize within the document itself. So you want to try to organize on a separate piece of paper so that you can just put your thoughts down and you don't have to worry about putting them in sentence form or in paragraph form or citations, right? It might sound like it's more work, but you're going to get better grades, and it won't be more work because you'll be more organized by the time you sit down to type. Now, this is particularly helpful in this situation because you have a lot of things that you have to pull together. So if you look at step 2 on this picture, organize is really going to be the critical part of writing a good paper. Now that's true of all papers, but it'll be even more true of this paper. And then I've put these 3 really obnoxious red arrows, is that you need to understand before you write an argumentative paper. And argumentative doesn't mean that you're trying to be obnoxious, right? It means that you're putting together a point of view and you're defending that. And so you're saying, this is what I think, and this is why I think it. So you have to start by identifying the conclusion. In this case, your standpoint is your conclusion. So, and that's how your identity has been shaped by both historical and structural relations. So this is your conclusion, this is your argument, and then you're going to show what you mean by this. So in the case study of student X and housing injustice, in that midterm, you were asked to do this. You're asked to see what this person's identity was and how the history and structure in this case means patterns of relationships, right? So the social structure, how does this influence that individual? So that's now what you're being asked to do for yourself. So it's good to make comparisons and contrasts to that case study for your own life. Some of you actually did that in the midterm, and so you'll be even further ahead for this part of the assignment. You should go back over the post-midterm review video because that will give you some kind of key points and some ways of thinking about writing this paper that will kind of keep you in the mindset of a socio-legal analysis. Now, after you've done those 2 things, and you've organized, you start to organize, you got these things kind of set out, then what you want to do is form a question that you're going to answer in your essay. And so this is what we call a critical inquiry. This is the thing that you're going to kind of back up, right? So it's a little strange to do, but you start with your standpoint, you start with your argument, and then now you think of a critical inquiry question that's going to get you to that argument. So it's kind of like backing it up and thinking, okay, how do I get here? Now, there's a few ways you could do this, but the easiest way would be to go back to your week 1 discussion board and see what you wrote, right? See what you were thinking when you started this class, and then form that into a question that takes kind of your argument and your original question and puts it into an inquiry. So how is this going to lead up to your argument is what you want to think about. How have you led to your argument over the last 8 weeks? And so that's one way that you could do it. Now, again, there's lots of different ways you could form an inquiry. You might have different questions now than you did in week 1. And so you really want to, take some time with this. And again, this is why this is the brainstorm session. And you want to just kind of write out a few different options before you settle on something. So I'll pause here to see if anybody has any questions about this stage.
Good morning, Professor. How are you?
I'm okay. How are you?
I have one question for the argumentative essay. Do you want us to argument our opposing argument? Should we oppose our argument as well as stand by our argument too in the essay, or just put our point out there?
So your question is probably great for an English class. It's terrible for a social science class. So let me tell you why. The way you frame this, it sounds like some of the classes I've seen, right? When you have a composition or an English class and they say, you're going to argue and you're going to say chocolate is better than vanilla. And then you're supposed to give the opposing argument, which is vanilla is better than chocolate. Now, personally, I think these are like the dumbest essays that anyone could ever write. But I understand that they're just getting you to practice writing. That's not what we do in social science, and it's not what we mean by argumentative essay. So we don't, when I say argumentative essay, or any professor in your social science classes, which are criminal justice classes, don't think that what they mean are two people arguing with each other. That's not what they want. What they want is, if you look at number 3 where it says develop arguments, right? So for and against is not two people, it's 2 points of view. So in this sense, you have your standpoint, which has been constituted by historical structural relations, right? So maybe you're an immigrant, maybe you're a woman, maybe you're a person of color, right? Maybe you're somebody from a poor economic background, right? So the opposite point of view would be the counter argument here. Does that make sense?
Yes, I understand. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough, right? Because it's one of my pet peeves is that in the English class, they're teaching you to do something that is not very helpful for our classes. But so I just want to make sure everybody, this is not like a he said, she said type of paper. This is, you have to try to compare your position to another position. Now that happens, and most of you did this in the midterm, right? So remember, student X is transgendered. Now, some of you gave that person a gender, but you're forgiven for that. There are people in the story, like the white woman, who treats X differently based on their different cultural position. So that would be the counter argument here, is that one person is looking at the situation from one point of view, and this is how they see law, and then X is seeing the law from a different point of view because they have different experience. So notice they're not arguing with each other. Right? It's just that you're putting forth their point of view or their standpoint.
So, Professor, I have a question.
Yeah.
So, what we did for our midterm is also what we're doing for this essay.
You could think about it like that's you jogging, and now you're running a marathon. So it's not the same thing, right? But it was an introduction. It was a good way to get started. Hopefully you'll do a much better job, right, on this paper. If anyone's still confused, by the way, about argument, you should look up the word rhetoric. R-H-E-T-O-R-I-C. That's what in education we used to call these papers. I don't know why they switched it to argument, to be honest with you. It just did nothing but confuse students. but it's the art of rhetoric. It's about putting your position forward and maintaining it with evidence.
Okay, that makes sense, Professor.
Yeah, I have no idea why. I don't know why they changed. I think they changed the name in the 90s. I don't know. A lot of crazy things happened in the 90s. Okay, I'm gonna move on because this is kind of, I think you should be pretty good with this part, and we'll come back to this if you're still struggling with it next week. I think the other big thing that I saw I think in the discussion board posts is, go back to the week 1 reading and then look at the article I provided for you on Law and Society. This will help you better understand what a socio-legal analysis is. But here are the 4 points that you have to use in your paper. You have to apply these concepts. This is what will show me that you understand what a socio-legal understanding is. So the big thing that I think most of you have shown me in our discussions each week is that you now understand that there's a huge gap between what the US Constitution says and what people think it says. And that's a gap between how daily people, right, how everyday people are living their lives. That those two things aren't the same thing. So for example, people love to say that everyone is equal. Right? And then you ask them, well, what do you mean? They say, well, everybody should be equal. And then you ask them, is everybody equal? And everybody says no, right? So you see how that gap is shown by just asking those 3 questions. So if we just stopped it like everyone's equal, then you can imagine the kind of answers you get in a legal class, right? Everybody's just pie in the sky, everything's great, everybody's always getting what they want, justice is clear, right? And that doesn't have anything to do with reality. And so what we're trying to get you to see in classes like this is how inequality is persistent, right? Why those words in the Constitution don't magically make everything better. And what people tend to do is that they say, well, it's the fault of the bad people. But of course, from the other point of view, you're the bad person. So it's your fault, right? So if everybody just says it's somebody's fault, then everybody's going to blame somebody else. And so that's also just as unrealistic as the kind of happy phrases in Constitution. So what we mean by how is, how are these structures, how are these relationships formed, and how are they maintained? And the first thing is to understand that there's a social hierarchy, right? And these can change from society to society. But in ours, as you all have kind of very clearly explained, is that elites, people with wealth and power, they're at the top. People without houses, right, people without homes, they're at the bottom. And so there's a bunch of relationships that are formed through law that maintain that structure, that make it impossible for that social change to occur. Once people are aware of this gap, oftentimes, like the civil rights movement, like the women's vote movement, like the labor organizing, what we just saw in Staten Island for Amazon, once they realize that they're being treated unfairly, they often work together, which we call mobilization. They mobilize together and they go against the powerful structure. But it doesn't always work like that. Sometimes people don't do that. Sometimes they say, well, that's just, the famous Brooklyn, it is what it is, and they're just going to live with their powerlessness. They're just going to let it be unfair. Or you get these trivial statements that people say life is unfair, and so there's nothing they can do about it. But there's a third situation where people, they get together, they think about mobilizing, and then they start thinking about different ways of pressuring the powerful. So they start negotiating. They start threatening. They start using hashtag politics, right? They go to the news media. There's lots of different ways that people can reduce the inequality. One of them is through the law, legal mobilization. One of them is through pressure. One of them is through voting, right? Another one is through avoidance, right? They don't want to get involved. And so that's now leading to this idea of polyvocality of legality, meaning there's not one story about law. right? There's a lot of different stories about law, and you learned 3 of those type of stories. Before the law, where the law appears to be this magical, king-like religious experience, where if you do something naughty, there's going to be a punishment, right? So it's a very childish way of looking at the law. Then there's with the law, where it's like a game, and all you have to do is know the rules of the game, and you're going to win the game. Donald Trump, that's how he sees the law. Then there's up against the law, right? That's like the Black Lives Matter movement. That's people that you've seen in critical race theory saying that the law is kind of out to get you. It's trying to trap you. It's trying to get you to do things that are against your interest. And so you need to talk about those 3 ideas of law and think about how they address that unequal power relationship. This is why standpoint theory is so important, right? Because you're bringing multiple points of view into a conversation. So there's not just one way of experiencing the law, there's multiple points. And one of those very important points is your point of view. Your point of view is an important point in this paper. So you need to develop that. And this is not just what your opinion of law is, this is how have you experienced law. So this might be a struggle for many of you, and so this might be what you bring back questions next week so that we can get into depth about what this would mean for you. We can do that here as well today, but you might need time to think about it. The last piece of this is difficult. This is where you're going to need to use the course materials, which is the next slide. Judicial precedent. So precedent is this thing that basically exists because the Supreme Court says it does. And it doesn't seem like that should matter very much, right? The Supreme Court writes some words, so what? But for some reason, in the United States, it actually has a great amount of influence. So as you're seeing with the Roe v. Wade decision, people really care about what the Supreme Court says. And so this is what is important about what they say. It's not really about the case itself, it's about the language they use, because that circulates and informs people's consciousness about what they think rights are. And so what you're going to do is you're going to look at these cases and you're going to think about how they inform people's ideas about what rights are. Now to do that, you go to the course materials. So I've structured this so this is kind of like your own personal resource library, right? And so as you see on the right-hand column, you had 3 different weeks where you read a bunch of information about how to do what I'm asking you to do right now. They've been organized in a way to help you think about the large social structure. And so if you go back and watch Uneven Growth video again, you'll see how much economics is playing, how much poverty, wealth, property, how much that plays into this whole kind of game of constitutional law. Then I gave you the segregation map to help you see that it's not just, gentrification doesn't just have to do with just housing, it also has to do with education. And so because New York City is the most segregated city in the history of the United States, you're going to have segregated education. So not only do people not have equal access to housing, they don't have equal access to education. And so these are now compounding factors, right? We had economics was affecting housing, now it's also affecting education, which means upward mobility, which means jobs, right? Which means money, which all these things that people care about. So that should lead you to this question, like, why is it this way? And so the answer to that was from class 2. You look at the lecture again, property, right? Constitutional law protects private property. And if you remember, it's the uneven distribution of property. So it's the Constitution, just to be blunt, doesn't really care about equality. It cares about inequality. It's trying to make sure that people in power stay in power. And that's common sense if you think about it, because people in power are the ones who wrote the Constitution, right? It wasn't the powerless that got to write the Constitution. So then that leads you to this idea of, I need proof, right? That's what people say. It's like, that's a great conclusion, but I need proof. So all of these readings are proof that the Constitution doesn't create equality. And so you see it through the Dahl studies, which is a social science experiment. You see it through Patricia O'Collins talking about her experience, and then another person experience who was denied housing. You hear about it from Bell Hooks as she's talking about how education tends to ignore class, right? Doesn't talk about poverty, doesn't introduce concepts like housing injustice in most classes. You learned about it from Martin Luther King Jr., who's talking about really the philosophy of resistance, why it's not only proper and legal to resist injustice, it's also your duty to resist injustice. You learned from Plessy versus Ferguson how the Supreme Court can use their precedent to maintain inequality, to maintain difference and separation. The example with Raven with Oprah is interesting because she's pushing back. So this is kind of a younger generation pushing back on an older generation, trying to label them. And so you see this kind of in practice, this idea of consciousness, of awareness of the inequality, and then the mobilization against it. And for those of us who are old enough, there was actually quite a bit of support for Raven during that time. So this was kind of a way of pushing back and resisting this kind of label that was been placed. With lots of legal categories in that video, there's lots of things that Oprah is repeating that have their basis in law. This also then was seen in Miller versus California, where you see where one group, a minority of people, so that's not minorities, right, or minoritized persons, but a small group of right-wing evangelical Christians defined what they thought should be obscenity. And so then they held this law, they criminalized behavior, lots of people in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, whom they thought were obscene or immoral. And so they were charging them with crimes, even though most people would look at what they're doing and kind of scratch their head and say, I don't understand what is the crime. But this is showing you how a small group of people in power can use the law to create injustice. The Najla Saeed then piece kind of helps you see that there's not one identity, right? That your identities are constituted or constructed by the environment around you. So it helps you explore those different identities. So does Justice Sotomayor kind of repeats this idea, is that you kind of have to adjust and adapt as you go through life. And so she says you have to work harder, and what she meant was minoritized women have to work harder. Not in the sense that like, yay, let's go work harder. It's an expression of the reality, is that people are stereotyping, they're working against you, they don't believe that you're going to be able to be successful, and so that's what forces you to have to work harder. So again, it's the historical structural relationships that are doing that. It's not individuals. And then finally, in Marbury versus Madison and the Federalist Papers, you get just kind of this grounding, this historical reality of how the courts constructed this environment. And you see that they did this largely through the idea of precedent, that judicial precedent is the thing that sets the standard for the behavior of the future. And so this is how it becomes so influential over time. And then finally, you see how this works out in a very practical way. What exactly do people in the Supreme Court do? And so you get this kind of practicing of what this looks like in the real world. So I'll pause there and see, are there any questions about these resources or how you would use them? Okay, looks like we're all okay. So this is what you want to have ready for next week. So after you've come up with your inquiry, then you're going to go through those materials and pick the ones that are going to help you answer your own inquiry. They're going to help you with your argument, how you're going to support yourself. So the best way to do this is to get out a sheet of paper, or you could do it in a Word document. Make a table like the one you see here, and put, I'd say, at least 2 themes, but no more than 3 themes. So you make these little boxes, and then in theme 1, And so let's say you decide you're going to start with judicial precedent. So you're going to write precedent as your theme 1. What did the courts do? You're going to go back through those readings, and you're going to see how does what the court says, how does that affect your argument, your standpoint, your identity? And then you'd put that in the little box here where it says your main argument. Then you'd list the course material support using the citation method I gave you in the last slide. Then think about your analysis. What does this have to do with socio-legal? What does it have to do with the gap between law as ideal, as written in the text, and how it affects real people's lives? And then from there, you'll generate a solution. What would be one way of addressing that gap in the court cases as it applies to your argument? And then you do the same thing for your second theme, and then you do the same thing for your third theme. And this would be a good way to organize an outline before you start writing your paper. You could bring this next week, right? And we can talk about any areas you're struggling. You might have a blank box and you want to figure out what to put in it. You might want to share this, right? Share your screen, and we can work on it together. But this is a way of organizing so that we have a good basis for working on our papers. So are there any questions about this method?
Yeah, so what was just the example of just a theme, just the example that you use for that, like what was like a topic, an example topic that you came up with in one.
You're asking what could be possible themes?
Well, yeah.
So one approach would be just to have theme 1 be polyvocality, right? So the 3 narratives. Theme 2 could be standpoint. So bringing those multiple narratives into conversation. And then theme 3 could be the judicial cases, the precedents. That's one approach, right?
Okay.
You could also come up with, like, maybe you want to put theme 1 as all 3 of those things. And then theme 2 is what you don't like about those 3 things, right? And theme 3 is what you do like, right? So there's different ways of organizing that will work for you, but it kind of depends on your main argument. I mean, let me be super blunt here. If you identify yourself as a white male, your organization table should be very different than a woman of color. It would make no sense for those 2 things to look alike. Because we're talking about standpoint. We're talking about your individual experience with legality. And so that's why I'm saying, it needs to be, the themes will need to be kind of particular to you. But here's one possibility that you could do. I'm putting these 3 concepts here is because you have to apply those terms. So this is like, for students who are terrified of that, of not being able to do it, it might be easier just to make this part of your organization. And so, and to be clear, I mean, I get a question here, does this have to be completed by next week, right? I'm gonna quote my favorite professor at Kingsborough, Dr. Christopher Chapman, do you, right? I think you should do this. It'll be very hard for you to complete the paper without it, but no, you don't have to do it, right? You could do it your own way and take your chances. I just get nervous when people don't do what I ask them to do. Okay, so now I'm going to go to the reason why we do this. The reason why we do the organization is because this is really how you write a college level paper. So I gave you lots of branding over here to the upper right about where you should go to learn about how to really actually write a college paper, right? So Purdue OWL is like the place that everybody tends to go. So this also gives you more information on what is an argumentative essay. So going back to the earlier question, right? This is what we mean when we're asking you to write a paper like this. And really, often really all this means is you're developing a thesis and then you're supporting it. But what's nice about Purdue OWL is they've got exercises, they've got little things that help you out, and then they've got example papers like the one I took a screenshot of here, right? And so you can really see exactly how to write a paper. Now, the other side of this is the left side, right? Where this is literally how you're organizing your paper and writing it, is that I should see your main argument in paragraph 1. So this is another difference from those English classes, right? In the English class, they have you write these like really silly introductions trying to get the quote-unquote reader interested. I'm interested in your main argument, so I want to see that in paragraph 1. You know, it should be very clear what it is you're trying to say in your paper, and then the rest of the paper is going to explain what you're saying. And so, of course, you use an introduction sentence, right? But usually the introduction sentence will be an introduction to the topic, right? So what is it that you're talking about in this paper? So if you look at the example here, they're saying faculty evaluation development cannot be considered separately, blah, 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 blah. We know exactly what this paper is about. It's going to be about faculty evaluation. How do you evaluate professors in the context of education, right? So they don't hold that out to like the 6th paragraph. They tell me that right up front. And then they're going to give you their thesis. They want you to include diverse measures, including peer observations, development of teaching portfolios, and student evaluations, right? So now I know what they want to do in the paper. And the question of whether this is a good paper or bad paper is, do they do it? Do they show me what they mean by peer observations, teacher portfolios, and student evaluations? Does that support what they were saying? That's how your paper is going to be judged as well, right? You're going to support your first argument in the 2nd paragraph. I should see course materials. I should see that relate, that make sense, that are applicable to what your argument is. And then you move on to your 2nd argument. And then you do the same thing you did in the 1st paragraph. You're just doing it now with the 2nd argument. And then you do the same thing that you did in the 1st argument. You support your argument with new and different course materials. After you've done that, and you could do that one more time, to be honest with you. If you had 3 themes, you could do that 3 times. You don't have to. You should do at least 2. Then you apply the socio-legal check. You need to explain in 2 to 3 sentences, how do the legal narratives apply, the 3 different ones? How is judicial precedent applying? And you need to be able to essentially make an observation about that, right? You're adding something new to the understanding. You're using the terms in such a way that everybody now can use this. And this is where your standpoint will really come through. That you'll say, I see this way because, and I'll be able to say it. So a good example, or a good practice, is to use an example. Right? Try to dig something up either from your course experience, something you had like an aha or a light bulb moment at some point in the class, or something you saw out in the real world, or an example that you make up, right? You just think about an example that would apply. Then really the next part is probably the part where you're going to want to really spend some time thinking, which is you got to consider that not that you're wrong about your point of view, right? Your standpoint can't be wrong, but try to consider your point of view from other points of view, right? How will this actually speak to the larger structure, right? Not everybody experiences the world like you. So you have to think about, how do other people experience law and reality? That's really what the critical analysis is you're kind of reflecting back on what you've said. So you need to reread what you wrote, and then you think about it. You think about, how does this really apply and affect in the larger social environment? Is this something that could be changed in the structure? What would it require to make a change, right? Something like that. You just reflect back on what you've talked about. So this really, if you've been involved in class discussions, you'll probably have lots of examples that you could draw from. You could also use examples from real life, right? Just making observations out in the real world. And then you want to propose a solution, right? What would be the solution to solve this problem of inequality that you're seeing in the reality of the socio-legal world? And then in your last paragraph, you should explain how you now have a deeper understanding of legality and constitutional rights. Now, don't say I have a deeper understanding of legality and constitutional rights, right? You need to explain that, right? So what have you learned about this class that helps you have a deeper understanding, that you really get it now? Now you kind of see where you could take this information in the future. Okay, so are there any questions? This is how your paper would look. So are there any questions about this?
Yes, Professor, I have a question. So like each bullet is a paragraph?
Let's see if that's true. So bullet 1, main argument in paragraph 1, yes, that's a paragraph. Support your first argument in paragraph 2, yes. Second argument, yes. Support your first argument in paragraph 2, yes. I think the apply a socio-legal check, that's probably, I think it's a paragraph to do the 2 to 3 sentences explaining the terms, and then probably a paragraph for making an observation. Some of you could do an observation or example in 1 sentence, but some of you, most of you, I think, will probably need 3 or 4 sentences to make an observation or an example. Then the critical analysis, that could be, this kind of goes to how comfortable of a writer, how experienced you have. I'd say most of you should just in your draft probably do 3 paragraphs for the critical analysis. If you're doing 5, you're doing too much. But some of you could probably do the critical analysis in 1 paragraph. So maybe start with 3 and see if you can reduce it to 1. But again, 5 would be way too much. A solution, if you really, really know what you're talking about and you've written a good paper, the solution probably should be 1 sentence. But, sometimes you need a couple more sentences, so then now that's a paragraph, right? And then the last paragraph, yeah, that one's definitely just a paragraph. So, it could be it should be a little bit more than just 1 paragraph per bullet, but most of them will be paragraphs. So the socio-legal check and the critical analysis, that will probably most likely be 3 or 4 paragraphs.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yes, exactly, Matthew. Right. How you structure the paragraph. One thing that I'll give you, this is kind of going back to the tips. There's this really annoying John Mayer song, Say What You Need to Say. A lot of students don't say what they need to say. They say a whole lot more than they need to say. So taking the time to structure your paragraphs will reduce how many words and sentences you need, because you'll be clear, and it will build just like, like little Legos or little blocks. You're just building up to a point. And so we teach, the way we teach composition is there are 4 sentences in a paragraph. And so the first sentence is the topic, second is a transition, third is a thesis, and then the fourth is transitioning to the next topic. And so you take your time and organize, you'll have nice clean paragraphs, and you won't tend to repeat yourself over and over and over again. And hopefully, some of you I've noticed in some of your responses, both on the Google Forms and in discussion boards, you don't get extra points for using words you don't know the meanings of. And it becomes painfully obvious to the professor that you don't know what these words mean, because they usually don't apply to the question, right? I assume you copied and pasted something from the internet, and it just doesn't really make any sense because it has nothing to do with what we've been talking about. And so this is a chance for you really to go back into the course materials and to apply your reasoning. So I would like, so Felicia has a question. I'd like somebody else to answer this question. This is like a pop quiz. So the question is there a topic list to choose from? Can somebody answer this question? I'll give you extra credit if you can answer this question.
Well, Professor, didn't you say it's going to be different based on everyone's experience, since, we're all different?
Right. So help us understand then. So what is it? Where do you start then?
Well, you said to start with reading the reading from week 1 and the Callahan case. I think for me it was much easier to kind of understand in the previous slide, because it also was a little bit difficult for me to understand what exactly, like she asked the question. But I think looking at it like this, it's much easier. And also like the other one where you included all the course documents and stuff, the information. But yeah, what Matthew said, student X, and yeah.
Anybody else?
I believe you're saying that we have to formulate inquiry or a question based on what we've learned in the class so far and use the readings from the past to support that question and help us build essay?
You're 95% of the way there. Very close. The difference is just you have to then connect that. Your inquiry has to be connected to your standpoint. So how is your identity shaped by historical structural relations? That's your conclusion. That's your quote-unquote argument. And so exactly what Matthew is saying. The ultimate paper, the main point of your paper, is that it's going to be based on your own perspective of legality. The dilemma of that type of paper is you have to understand what that means before you can answer that question. So that's why you have to go back to your course materials and make sure that you understand very clearly and that you can explain what these 3 perspectives of legalities are, why they matter. Then it should be very easy for you to explain how your standpoint has been structured.
Professor, so we have to include all 3 terms that you just mentioned, the 3 themes?
You have to show
these 3.
You have to show these 4 concepts, right? So it's not about using the terms, right? If you just write this term, that doesn't mean that you're going to get a good grade.
Yeah.
You have to show me you understand what these concepts mean.
Okay.
So let me jump ahead back to, these are the learning outcomes, the big 3 learning outcomes, right? So I put like teacher language on the left and then student language on the right, right? So you have to show me that you understand, this is like a checklist. So understand number 1, the United States Constitution protects private property rights instead of human rights. So again, it's not just saying that. If you just say that, that doesn't mean that you get a good grade. You have to show me you understand what that means. And you can show me you understand what that means using the course materials, because there's lots of examples that have been provided that show me that you understand that. The second thing is that you have to show that you understand that the constitutional legal structure is what produces homelessness and inequality. We don't have inequality because people are bad people. We have inequality because that's what the system wants. The system works perfectly. It produces inequality, and so that's why we have it. And so you have to be able to show me not just that you understand that, but how you understand it. For me,
And then,
For me,
and we could, sorry.
1, 2, 3, go.
And we could include from here student X, like to kind of back up our idea.
Okay, you could do that. I don't know how successful you'll be. So this is to you and to Felicia. I don't know that that's the example of showing you how to do it. There's not going to be a lot that you can draw from, right? That was like your practice, like we were talking earlier. That was like your jogging, right? So can you go back and talk about jogging in order to run a marathon? Maybe. I don't know if it helps you run the marathon better, but I doubt it, right? I think this is now time you have to step it up. And so
you wouldn't recommend to use any, like, the midterm?
Yeah, I wouldn't
like, for reference.
What I would do is you refer to the midterm as your understanding, right? It shows you how to organize all of these thoughts. But what I was going to say is, like, for me, when I think about how would I show that I understand point 1 and point 2 here, I refer, like when I'm talking to regular folks, I refer to Patricia Collins' Power of Self-Definition and Bell Hook's story about confronting class, because I was first in my family to go to college, and so it was strange that I would go to these classes and it sounded like we were just hanging out with a bunch of rich people and they didn't really have any idea what my life was like. And then when I learned about other people's experience who were similar, but then because they were black women, they had a double injustice. They had a second level of injustice that was beyond my experience. Then that was kind of my aha moment. I said, oh, wait, this is a system, right? This is the structure that's doing this. This isn't just one or two bad people. When you get to that point, then you should then have an inquiry. You should have a question. Why is it this way? And how could it be different? That's where we then reflect for a second. We say, okay, so the Constitution protects private property rights, and those are used to control the powerless. So minoritized people, indigenous populations, African Americans, the poor, right? There's all these different groups that property rights are trying to control. But because this concept of rights, that somebody has rights and they can use them, exists in the language, people who are being controlled start to say, well, I have rights too then. And so they started to use rights talk to organize with other people and start to use that against the powerful. And so that leads to this consciousness, that leads to this change where people start then saying, you know, this isn't fair, this isn't right. And so that's constitutional law in a nutshell. Now I say that, right? I mean, I've been doing this for a very long time, so it's easy for me just to say these things, right? But I'm just giving you an example from my own experience of how I would approach a paper like this.
Are we able to use this final preparation to kind of guide us to the inquiry question?
Yes.
Like, can we?
Right.
Okay.
Right. That's like, those are things you'd put in that box where it says you need to understand before you can argue.
Mm-hmm.
So in your own notes, you know, you write those 3 things and maybe you kind of, provide examples. So in the notes, you could talk about student X, okay, and the challenges that they face legally. Those would be in your notes. If you look over to the right, I'm not sure that those notes would be the strongest case for your argument about how your identity is shaped by historical structural relations. Unless you've been denied housing in the same way that X was, then that's a great example. Or if you've been discriminated against in the workplace in the same way as X's friend was, right? Then those would be good examples, right? But they'd have to be built on top of the course materials as well to be great examples. The way I think about this right now as you're asking your questions is, this kind of a paper is kind of like you're at your house, you're hungry, but you don't have any food. So you have to go to the grocery store. So you think about what you want to make for dinner. You go to the grocery store, you take all these different boxes, ingredients, right? You put them in your cart. That's what you're doing right now. You're at the grocery store, you're getting your course materials, you're getting your ideas, you're thinking about what you want your meal to be. When you go to write the paper, now you're actually making the meal, right? So this is organizing in your kitchen, you're getting all the pieces together. Now here's the meal. You're making the meal. So it's going to look different at each stage of the process. Whereas what I think most of you tend to do is you just go into your kitchen and you make a meal. That's how you write a paper. And that's why you get a, not a great grade. Are there any other questions?
That was a good analogy.
Thanks, yeah. I'm hungry.
So that means, right? When we prepare the meal, right, which is our essay, when you read it, the way that you would see we do everything we're supposed to do as if it tastes good to you, right?
That is a perfect way, right, exactly. If it tastes the way that you intended for it to taste when you put all these ingredients together.
So that when you eat it, you'll be satisfied with the paper.
Right. Right. And that everyone really, that we all are very clear about what it is that, we're looking at. I'd say that's the number one problem in most of the essays I read. I have no idea what on earth you're saying. And so that's why, as a writing intensive instructor, right, as a writing instructor, I'm helping you break this down. Right? I've used this approach in multiple classes. This is the first time I've ever done it online, to be honest with you. I've always done it in person. So we're trying this out. So next week is hopefully similar to being in person, where I'll let you all share your screens and you can show me what you're working on and we can all work together. Or you can just ask questions and we can go from there. And remember that the draft is due the 23rd. And you'll have done what you needed to do, and that's a 15. Or you're getting there, and that's a 10. Or you're a long ways away, and that's a 5. So even if you have a terrible paper, you're still going to get some credit. And if you have a pretty okay paper, you're going to get decent credit. The more work you put in, right, and put in a really good draft for the 23rd, then you'll get the most credit. But we have a few steps along the way to help you get the best paper possible. And then you'll have plenty of time, right, from May 23rd to June 12th, right, to put together the best possible paper you can for your final draft. And there'll be a grading rubric, so you'll know exactly what you need to do, and you'll have feedback from me. Okay, so for next week, which I'll put what I'm asking you to do in the attendance verification this week is there's a question here that tell me what you want specifically for next week. So here are elements that we talked about today, or you can put other if there's something that you think you want me to specifically cover next week. So this just tells me if none of you pick citations, right, then I'm not going to talk about citations next week. But it gives me a sense if everybody picks one of these things, we'll talk about all these things again, but it just gives me a better idea of what you would like me to do for next week so that I give you as much help as possible leading up to your draft. And then just remember, even the week that's the next week when the draft is due, we're still going to meet just in case you have any more questions so that you can work on your draft. It won't be due until the end of the week. I want you to have the best possible draft you can.
Professor, after we submit this draft, are we able to redraft, or is it until the final? Like, are we able to keep working on it until the final, basically?
So it's so tough to answer that question. I'm doing calculations in my mind. Probably. I mean, the main thing will be. Here's my hesitance, right? Sometimes what happens is I take the time, I read the paper, I give what I think is really great, thoughtful feedback, and then I get another submission where they change like 2 words. So then I just read the paper again, and you didn't really follow my feedback, and so now how long are we going to play this game, right? So if I feel like some of the papers, let me put it this way, some of the papers, if you get a 15 and I give you feedback saying like do this, then that's probably, you're probably good to go. If you get a 10, I'll probably say what you're missing, and I'll say please just try to address these things. So let's say then, a couple weeks later you're like, I think I did this, can I email you? And I'd say yes, of course, right? You email me, and then we figure out whether you did what you're supposed to do, right? If you get a 5, then I would expect to see a pretty big change in the paper before I give feedback again, right? I would need to see a pretty significant, like we're not going to do it like one sentence at a time. So it will really depend on the student, and it will depend on, I guess if you're asking for a second feedback, it would be helpful for me. What we do as professionals is we say what we want feedback for. So you say what you changed and what you're looking for from me. Then that allows my brain to just give you what you want without having to try to, magically figure it out. Pretty terrible answer, but it's
it was a good response. Thank you, Professor.
I'm just trying to be as honest as possible. So, and of course, you can email me, especially if you have questions about any part of this. And then what I'm hoping is, I've got you to start thinking about things. And then next week, hopefully you have more questions. Are there any other questions now? If you're good, right, you can go and fill out that form, the attendance verification form now, and I will see you next week.
Honestly, right about now, this seems like, okay, I gotta process it, but I think once I start to do it and take my time and put proper work into this, I would be fine.
Yeah, and it's, my goal would be everyone has an outline or a table next week, but if you're struggling with the inquiry, that's okay too, right? Everybody should just struggle for the next week in your own way, and then next week we'll move on and we'll improve. And then you'll still have one more week to put together your draft and check in again. So there's still lots of time and lots of support before you have something to submit.
Are we able to email you about, like, in case, like, you want to have, like, the chart ready before the class next week?
I'm gonna say this, like, you're hurting my heart. I mean, are there professors out there that you're not allowed to email? I mean, you all can email me for any reason, anytime. I will respond. I think I've responded to every single one of you. I don't think, if I haven't responded, let me know and I'll email you. You can email me for anything. Yes.
Okay, Professor. Would that be your Kingsborough email address?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, especially if you have a table. I mean, I know that's a really nerdy thing, but I enjoy helping people with tables. Okay, so don't forget the attendance verification.